Hello, everyone. This is the lecture for week 7. Should be about May 12th that we'll be covering this. Also on chapter 4 of this book, Disciples of All Nations. The chapter is called the Yogi and the Commissar. I've called this World Christianity or Global Christianity and Colonialism. So this class is particularly, or this lecture is particularly focused on Africa, but it really has implications for all of world Christianity. And I hope by covering this, you'll get some sense, especially by the end of this book, which is in general focused on Africa, but you'll get some sense for why we're focusing on Africa because you should see, if you have any exposure to other parts of the world where Christianity is also vibrant, including here in the United States, the ways in which the African experience has really set the path, told the future, explain what would happen in Christianity more generally. So, again, section by section, I'll go through this. The first section is called Theme, and the theme here, in this case, refers to the way in which Christianity really can be exploited by or exploit colonial power or imperial power. It can, in the most extreme case, in some cases here in Africa, uh, the missionaries welcomed and used gunships, used the threat of actual cannons and soldiers to force the Africans to treat them well, to respect them, to help them in their Christianizing mission. So, this is a very obvious and clear case of colonial power working hand in hand with mission, with Christianization. At the same time, we shouldn't just believe that colonialism and imperialism equals Christianity. Those two forces have intertwined in more complex ways than simply the gunships showing up. That did happen. We don't want to deny that it happened. But on the other hand, a lot of times the fact is that these African peoples embraced Christianity and made it into their own religion. And this has partly to do with language, for instance. The fact that the Christian message was translated into many African languages, leading to a kind of a cultural revival in almost every case, suggests that there's something more going on here than simply European gunships arriving and a people being forced to pick up a religion they did not want to pick up. Just because it is true that colonial powers sometimes work hand in hand with the impulse to Christianize does not mean that the Christian forms that took root or the Christianity that was part of this, that was the result of these efforts, is somehow illegitimate, is somehow faulty or wrong. I mean, in life, almost nothing is pure. If we think about anything, any good thing that has happened, any positive things that have happened, almost always there's some darker side to them. There's some unexpected consequence, there's some payment and some injustice that occurred in this path to progress. This is never to justify the injustice or the evil, but simply to think carefully about dismissing things completely out of hand, and saying, there's nothing redeeming about this. This is totally wrong because anything bad ever happened on the path there, if that makes sense. The That is just simply, from our understanding, I think from a realistic understanding of history in the world, is how things happen. Many things, almost everything, has some complex roots. So, moving on to the next section on ground rules, we can think about this is kind of Sanneh's pun for how rule was accomplished on the ground. And what he's talking about here is something that's often been called collaborators, something that's often been considered as people who are considered as traitors to their nation, traitors to their cause. And of course, it's relevant because some of these people cooperated with European political power, and then sometimes they cooperated with European religious power. These are sometimes converts who are called collaborators. And part of the point here, again, is that the story is not as simple as it seems. We could easily set up a binary where there's good, white hats and black hats, or good ones and bad ones. But the fact is, the very fact that there are collaborators shows that actually the story, kind of the narrative of European or colonial domination that's often told, the empire marching forward, is not that simple. The fact is, the empire needed to share its power. The empire or the Europeans needed natives in order to make their project work. And without these natives, they weren't able to. So a collaborator is another way of saying shared power. And natives had to make complex kind of decisions and that could sometimes even overthrow the colonial power, and could work for good or evil to their home communities. It's not, again, so simple as the foreigners dominating. The fact that they needed to educate natives, the fact that they wanted religion to help natives come to their side. It shows how difficult a time it was for them not only just to conquer them, but even conquer these other countries, but even more to rule them. It really showed that there is a imperialism and colonialism obviously have their dark side, but the roots of resistance sometimes are there, and people who seem to be collaborators are sometimes making decisions that are not so black and white. Uh, Now, to go directly, the next section on overlordship is pretty long, and I've given you a lot of questions about this, so I'm going to cover this in a number of different ways. First, I want to talk like Sanneh does directly about some of the strongest critiques of missions and of Christianization that have ever been lodged in academia, or at least not ever, but at least in recent years. And this is basically the cultural imperialism argument, the idea that missions were forced upon native people. The native people were brainwashed, they were fooled and tricked into receiving Christianity, or forced into receiving Christianity, which destroyed their native culture, which destroyed their ways of life, which was a kind of mental or ideological domination. And the irony of this is that people who argue this couple he's talked about here, the Komarovs, these academics, these people are basically perpetuating the exact thing that they blame on the missionaries. So they say the missionaries erased native agency. They did not allow Africans to think for themselves. They steamrolled them and caused them to, or destroyed their culture as if the Africans were totally passive and were not able to resist. Well, when you make this academic argument, you're actually committing the same error, because many Africans have chosen Christianity, and you're making the assumption that this choice cannot possibly be real. You're not respecting the African agency in choosing Christianity and in reformulating Christianity in many cases to fit their own interests or their own desires. So, is it the fact that Africans can only be tricked? I mean, you're basically tricking them both ways this way, or being dominating them both ways, saying that the missionaries dominated them and speak for them, so to speak. And now you're speaking for them. You're speaking for them and saying that their Christianity cannot be genuine and represents a colonial domination. And we'll come to see this is not clearly the case. There's a much more mixed picture here. One example we can see that comes up in this section is that of Albert Schweitzer. There is a point that the Komarovs are making that Sanneh concedes, and I think that's hard to deny, which is that Europeans remained aloof from African culture for a long time. There is a kind of one directionality to a lot of African European interactions, especially in the earlier period, when Europe's power and wealth relative to Africa's allowed it to basically Europeans to live close to Africa, to even live in Africa. In this extreme case, we have Albert Schweitzer, who won a Nobel Prize and was living among Africans doing charity work, but remaining completely aloof from them, just not really understanding them or allowing them to understand him. He just felt the cultural barrier was too big. In a lot of ways, we can see Europeans behaving this way. They live next to Africa, they meet Africans, but they never really, in depth, come to understand the African ways of life. Uh, and the response in some cases to this from the Africans, we see two particular cases. One of it's actually Osa. I'm not sure if I'm doing the clicking right, but I've been told any click is better than nothing. This Osa chief and Charles Domingo. So with the chief, the idea is they turn these Christian ideas back on them, back on the Europeans. They've asked questions to the Europeans to tell them, do not remain so aloof. We want to influence you too, or we've heard you and we can engage you in debate. And the chief suggests that basically, according to the Bible, God, according to the Bible itself, it was white men who killed Jesus. It was white men who caused Jesus all these problems, not black men. And so he argues that black men are actually innocent, or more innocent, more righteous in this way. And he also points out that God was the one who directly made him chief, whereas the queen is the one who's appointing these other chiefs, these colonial agents and governors and traders that come here. And so he asks, which one is more righteous? Which one has more right to rule? Me, as a black man directly appointed by God who did not attack God, or you who killed Jesus and are appointed only by a queen? And so you can see how Christianity allows Africans in their own hands to turn the question back. This is the agency we're talking about that we don't want to erase, that Africans can use Christianity and make it their own. Another example is Charles Domingo, who is an African who emphasizes a certain kind of Christianity that has very African elements that Europeans don't know what to do with, but that actually go back to the roots of Christianity as a Jewish religion, as a development of Jewish religion. And these include keeping the Sabbath, for instance. These include uh, other kind of Hebrew type elements that we've seen before. And like the Zion, like building a new Zion, that again is a reference to Jerusalem, to the capital city of Hebrew, a Zion of peace. Jerusalem means the foundations of peace. So, in many ways, Africans were captivated by the biblical message and were able to expound it in ways that Europeans had not seen before. And the Europeans responded by calling Domingos kind of forms of Christianity uncivilized or immature, but actually it was gaining serious grassroots appeal, gaining serious followers in his country. And so, finally, to end this section on overlordship, just to flesh out how complex this kind of colonial story is, and take a look at two very important kind of white figures who are commonly associated with Africa. One is Cecil Rhodes, who gives us the Rhodes Scholarship and many other famous schools. And scholarships and funds. He's widely remembered now as a philanthropist, as a good person, one of the people whose money went to good use and loved humanity. And then we have David Livingstone, who's remembered now largely as kind of often ridiculed as a missionary who went overseas to the Africans, a jungle explorer, someone who did not understand the Africans or was just pushing Christianity, which was not welcome. And in actual fact, their reputations are exactly opposite from what the historical record shows us, or from what is probably a more accurate historical understanding, which is that Rhodes murdered and exploited untold millions of Africans to create his colonial empire. Both of them were trying to create an empire, but Rhodes, we could say, is trying to create a physical empire that profits the British and is under British rule, under white rule, whereas Livingstone is trying to create a spiritual empire, which is ruled by God and in the hands of the Africans themselves. So Rhodes is exploiting people, exploiting a lot of human misery to get the money that goes to these fancy scholarships in Oxford and all the top schools of the world to whitewash his name, so to speak, to make him seem like a grand person. And in some ways, his reputation shows that he succeeded. On the other hand, Livingstone, who was not wealthy, was going to Africa to oppose slavery, to try to help the Africans throw off white domination and the Arab slave trade. And he's warmly remembered. He's actually welcomed and loved in many African countries. Most of the African countries where he lived and spent the most time love Livingstone and continue to honor his memory, continue to erect statues and name things after him, because he really sowed the seeds for African independence. He nurtured a generation of African leaders that became the founders of their countries and the freedom fighters and the independence fighters. So they were really opposing each other, Rhodes and Livingstone, in their over the same areas in Africa. And in a way, Livingstone won, even though his reputation may not have won in the West. He actually won because the African independence he wanted to see has succeeded, whereas the British domination of these areas that Rhodes was trying to ensure forever has fallen apart. And so this brings us to the next section, which is called Empire Strikes Back, another kind of clever pun by Sanneh, to show how African ideas can eventually influence Europe. We saw in earlier section how the Europeans stayed aloof, kind of isolated, removed from Africa. They had the luxury of kind of trying to impose their thoughts on Africans and making them learn from them while not learning themselves from the Africans. But we have two kind of sections here. One on the novels of someone named Sheikh Hamidou Kane, who wrote these novels that really show how the African mindset is not conquered, but in fact reflects back to Europe. In fact, tries to conquer Europe and succeeds in many ways in infiltrating Europe. And he has these imagined conversations, for instance, in his novel between an African and a white man who've come there. And the African basically says Europeans have technological dominance, but technology and evidence, these are very surface qualities. They are not profound qualities. They are not deep qualities of the soul or of morality. And all that Europeans do is multiply the surface, become more and more superficial, more and more skating on the ice of morality and truth and humanity, because all they can do is have technology and mastery over technology. But the future, this African knight claims, he calls them a knight, is converging. Africans cannot ignore Europeans, and Europeans cannot ignore Africans. And the African depths of morality and spirituality will challenge the European kind of shallowness and superficiality. And another example, another of Kane's novels, talks about how these African young people who are being sent to European schools, seemingly sacrificed, seemingly given up, seemingly dispersed, allowing Europeans to dominate their minds. They're actually like seeds, like a farmer sowing seeds in the wind. And the fact is, they will grow, they will come to their own harvest. The sacrifice that buries them, the sacrifice that plows the soil and seems to destroy it, is the same thing that causes the harvest. So Kane kind of is a prophetically warning that Africans will come back and Africans will influence Europeans, which I mentioned in the last lecture. The largest religious congregation, largest Christian group in Europe now is run by an African. So in a lot of ways, these novels set the stage or show what the future holds. And in another way, you can see with these two, I won't get into the details, but you can see these two kind of Frenchmen who, in their travels in Africa, were so moved, in their cases, by by the Muslim religion, that they came back to Europe and eventually or went back to Africa as Christians, or more thoughtful about their faith, more serious, and infiltrated Europe with more respect for Islam, and in some ways more respect for its own Christianity. So again, we can see that eventually the tide comes in and the tide goes out. The Europeans try to dominate Africa, but there's this what Sanneh calls a Trojan horse, right? Like, if you know the story, basically something gets snuck back in, and the Africans manage to take over Europe in a certain sense, even despite without the European knowledge of it. So in this next section called Uprising, we see largely these two kind of figures, Jomo Kenyatta and this movement called Watu wa Mungu. And they kind of counterbalance each other. So Jomo Kenyatta is considered by some to be father of the country of Kenya, a real revolutionary who was raised in mission schools, who was Christianized at one point, but then came to really resent and reject the Christianity he had learned. And his whole point was that Christianity was kind of the tranquilizer to make the African calm, to pacify, to make the African more submissive, while the Africans' lands were being stolen and taken away from them, and they were being exploited by the cannon and the musket. The Christian and the education part were to keep them calm and to fool them, more or less, into accepting the damage that had been done to them. But even while he was working, and ironically, part of what brought him to power was a Christian movement, was an African Christian movement, this Watu Wamungu movement, which created very African, indigenous, you could say, authentic forms of Christianity that spoke to Africans. So they saw in the stories of the Israelites being freed from Pharaoh. They saw in Moses the liberator. They saw in the battle between good and evil warrant, strength, motive, inspiration for their battle against the British, for their battle against what seemingly undefeatable odds, British power, British control. They said, well, God is stronger. God is stronger than the British, and our Lord and righteousness will prevail. They had very particular forms of prayer, throwing their hands up to heaven while facing Mount Kenya. They were possessed by the spirit and would cry out in the cries of predators like leopards or lions. This was a sign of the spirit and of the power of the spirit coming upon them. And really, their movement led to and inspired a number of revolutions and armed resistance that in the end brought Kenyatta to power. So you see this kind of irony that you can see Christianity in two ways, and both of them have some truth to them. Surely, that Kenyatta says Christianity pacifies the people or tries to make them accept British rule, but on the other hand, Christianity inspires armed revolution. And in some ways, of course, Christianity probably has something to do with these two other themes we see at the end of this section, which is forgiveness. That in this decolonizing of Africa, in this process of decolonizing, many people expected or could expect ethnic cleansing, wholesale murder of whites, of Europeans, given the tragedy and the scale of suffering visited upon Africans. One might have thought that when the Europeans left, they would leave with a lot of bloodshed, that they would leave with a lot of Africans would be murdering them on their way out. But actually, even after taking control of his country, Kenyatta in some ways extended an olive branch. He extended an understanding of common humanity and a hope that his country could continue to work together, for instance, with the British government, even though the British government had been such a repressive force. So there may be some element of Christianity there, and there surely is some element of Christianity in this matter of translation. Why were Africans able to use Christianity so successfully for their own purposes, for revolutions, in their own forms of spirit, being filled with the Holy Spirit, being possessed or empowered by the Holy Spirit? How were they able to kind of invent these kind of new cultural forms that meant so much? Well, it had to do with the fact that they could read the Bible in their own language, which is a tiny fact that has been underestimated or even totally misunderstood as a colonial domination. People have argued in the past that giving Africans their own written languages, that the missionaries who came and created written languages where no languages were before, were furthering colonial domination using grammar, grammar rules, all these kind of ideas, foreign ideas that that didn't exist in Africa before. There may be some element of truth to that in some sense, but by and large, these forms of giving the people the Bible in their own language and giving them control over their own written languages, uh, in general, has been a source of real cultural renaissance in many cases, in hundreds of cases throughout sub-Saharan Africa, one of the most, probably the most linguistically rich region on Earth. Um, and you've seen in case after case, like the Kikuyu people that Kenyatta came from, that giving them their language, the Bible in their language, has actually created an outflowing, like a tide of poetry, of epics, of novels, and of stories, and of cultural creations, much like probably wasn't a coincidence, much like Shakespeare, when the King James Bible was created in English, over and over again, or Martin Luther's German and vernacular German, the beginning of the German language. And so over and over again, you actually see that translation and the creation of grammars and languages of the people are empowering tools that can that when people imagine that God is speaking to them in their language and they have these texts, they really gives them a sense of kind of pride, independence, and national identity or linguistic identity. And the flip side of that is this kind of sad quote that the worst part is not being dominated, is not having soldiers or markets or politicians be taken over, but the loss of a language. When you lose your land, you lose your power, you lose your money. Those are all acceptable. When you lose your own language, that marks the real death of a culture. And so maybe this is the flip side of that, that these languages were reborn, and so these cultures were reborn. Two sections we can probably cover together. Well, first is reciprocity, where we see that the missionaries work together with the with the secular power that sent them, and sanctified secular power, British bureaucrats, British government, and Africans turned around and used it the same way. We see this very striking case where the Africans said that, well, if God can justify the British and the Queen, why can't God justify our chiefs and our lineages, the chief and the chief's son? We want those to be our kings, and God says that that's okay. If God can justify one, why not the other? And actually, the English had set a precedent, basically, in this next section, English precedent of making a lot of compromises, we could say, between religion and secular power, so that Great Britain, so that the United Kingdom could be ruled smoothly. And we have history of bishops being appointed bishops, leaders of a Christian church that don't even believe in resurrection, which is a key tenet by any account of the Christian faith. They don't believe that Christ resurrected, but still they can be bishops because they're very wealthy donors, for instance. And Parliament and the king are supposed to keep heresies down, are supposed to control and help the religion, but they do nothing, and they have done nothing for centuries. So this is just a sign. I mean, if it seems crazy that God could justify one African king giving power to his son, the British have been doing crazier things with religion and politics for many years. And so that's the simple point there. And then the last point, or the last section of this chapter is called African Precedent. And here, just want to point out, or here Sanneh points out, that with African eyes, actually, the Christianity that the Europeans brought to them, that tried to give to them, was this kind of watered down distortion of real Christianity. When the Africans came, especially to read the Bible in their own languages and see it for themselves, they were kind of shocked that the European the so-called Christianity the Europeans were bringing them didn't seem to be Christianity at all. Didn't seem to be the Christianity that the Bible was describing. And we can give you three. I gave you three in my questions. I gave three kind of points that I wanted you to think about. One is technological comfort. The Africans recognized that what many Europeans meant by Christianity seemed to be modern civilization with all of its comforts. So, like nice roads, clean beds, soaps, good hygiene, and new hospitals. This is not exactly or at all what you find when you actually read the Bible or in the life of Jesus. Jesus was not emphasizing the use of certain soaps or clean, good roads or respectability or ease of life, comfortable beds. Jesus was the one who said, I don't have a place to lay my head down. Even foxes and birds have places to sleep. I have no place to sleep. So the Africans saw that Jesus had a very radical kind of message that the Europeans seemed to have totally forgotten in preaching civilization as their gospel. That's one point. A second point is political claims. Africans saw that Europeans consistently seemed to act as if the Christian message affirmed foreign domination, as if the Christian message sided with institutional power, with denying Africans self government, self control, when that was not the case. That did not seem to be the case, where the church was seen to follow directions only of God. And so Zulus, for instance, when they came to recognize this, they created their own independent church immediately. They said the Europeans refused to give us control, but we see no reason in the Bible why that should be the case. So they created their own self-propagating, self-governing institution, the Zulu Congregational Church. And then finally, they saw another European distortion in styles of worship. For a long time, Europeans seemed to tell the Africans this is the right way to worship, a decorous, kind of polite, proper way to worship God, which Sanneh kind of jokingly notes is rigor mortis, basically like a dead Teutonic way, Northern European style. Don't speak, don't talk in the sanctuary of God. Observe the holy silence of God, which is much more cultural than biblical. So Africans saw that in the Bible, the instruments that the Europeans wanted or liked, the organ, for instance, the pipe organ, are not mentioned in the Bible at all. Whereas the instruments that the Europeans banned, like African drums, you have cymbals and tambourines and other percussion instruments in the Bible. Drums are much closer to these instruments. And dance, African dance was also banned or seen as heathen, superstitious, uncivilized, immature, whatever, so-called by the Europeans. But really, this was a cultural issue. If you look at the New Testament, the Old Testament, you have David dancing with all his might before the Ark of God, for instance, and even exposing himself, barely clothed. And so the very things that Europeans seemed to blame the Africans for seemed actually biblical, seemed more authentic to the biblical faith. So in some ways, it's a surprise that something of Christianity came through at all. But a lot of that, again, has to do with the fact that the Bible was translated so that the Africans could see for themselves the kind of cultural distortions and help Europeans perhaps reclaim the Christianity that was always there as their inheritance. So that's the end of this lecture. Thank you for staying with me.